Okay, everyone. I want to welcome you here to our panel on threats to food security in 2023, the trade dimension. I'm Kyle Handley. I'm an associate professor here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego, and also the associate director of the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy, which is hosting this panel discussion. This is kind of an exciting but also dire topic because I think, global food security is obviously incredibly important worldwide, not just, to the people in Ukraine and nearby countries that are affected by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but even people here in the United States and elsewhere around the world. I mean, one of the main reasons for that is I think it's not just about Russia and Ukraine, it's about the spillovers to many other countries and kind of the knock-on effects that that's had in terms of other trade restrictions on food exports and things of that nature. Very similar to the situation that we saw in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when a lot of countries were putting various restrictions on exports for things that were essential during the pandemic. We had a previous webinar on this topic with two of our panelists here, Mark Mundler and Simon Evenett, on the impact of sanctions on Russia. And we brought in some additional experts this time to also talk about food security. So we have, just to give you an idea of our format, if you're in the audience here, we'll have about 30 minutes of discussion by our panelists. And then I'm going to open that up to Q&A. I hope we'll have about 20 or 25 minutes to take your questions. So that you'll see there's a Q&A on the Zoom here. Feel free to put your questions in there, and I'll try to filter and curate those and get them to our panelists. I do want to note that we are recording this, so you can watch it later if you have to jump off. Or you want to go back in and see some details on some of the slides of our panelists. So before we get started, I want to go ahead and just introduce everyone all at once. We'll start off today with Alberto Portugal. He's a senior economist in the Global Trade and Regional Integration Unit at the World Bank. He's worked on a variety of development and trade-related issues such as trade costs, trade facilitation and aid for trade, FDI standards and food prices. He's currently leading a World Bank project on global food security, and we're very happy to have him here today. Next up, we'll have Simon Evenett and Mark Mundler sharing a spot. Simon is a professor of international trade and economic development at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. He's also the coordinator of Global Trade Alert, which monitors trade restrictions worldwide, and the founder of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade. Mark Mundler is a professor of economics here at UC San Diego in the Department of Economics. He's an expert on trade and employment, offshoring, and large multi-sector models of global trade, which he's going to tell us a lot more about today. And then finally, we'll have Joseph Glauber. He's a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., where his areas of interest are price volatility, global grain reserves, crop insurance, and trade. He was the chief economist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture from 2008 to 2014, and very excited to hear his insights on this crisis in food security as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alberto Portugal, who has some slides and I think a lot of interesting things to tell us about this topic. So Alberto, you are up.
Thank you, Kyle. Let me just put the slides. Yeah, it's great to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation. So what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit the work we have been doing at the bank. I mean, we're my colleagues Nadia Rocha and Alvaro Spiche, they have been doing some work following a little bit what happened with food prices since the onset of the invasion of Ukraine. And I'm also, I mean, in collaboration with them, we're also going to be starting a new project. Basically, I'll show you at the end of the slides. So with further ado, so it's a little bit, I mean, this presentation is about the trade policy activism and food prices, and indeed it's really focusing on where we are after the start of the Ukraine war. So let me start with this slide showing the, food prices, the evolution of food prices before the war. Is already a COVID wall, basically. So we have three aggregates of price: agriculture products, cereals, export on the panel on the left hand, and on the right we basically decompose the cereal price indexes into maize, wheat, and rice. So we can see that after 1 year of the war, there's still this. There has been this surge in global food prices, but the prices also prices have subsided. Yet compared to the pre-war level, prices of some key staples are elevated. And indeed, when we look at a year-on-year basis, of the last observation, there is maize and wheat prices that are 15% lower, whereas rice prices are 19%. But obviously, compared to January 2001, they're higher. They're 24% and 7% higher in the case of maize and wheat, respectively, while rice prices are 3% lower. And obviously, one of the underlying reasons is that we have like this surge in global prices and in global inflation, and basically also one of the components is that there are higher production costs. So we don't really see that prices are going to be perhaps going down to a January 2021 level anytime soon. So this is basically the evolution of some policy actions that they're cataloged on two sides. On the import side, basically, obviously when prices started going up, governments start panicking because it would, especially for importer countries, it would lead to higher prices. So they started liberalizing, they started lowering tariffs. And obviously on the exporter side, especially for big exporters, there were some active measures regarding export restrictions, including export bans. So this is a graph showing the evolution of these measures, and this has been done with in collaboration with GTA. Simon will talk, I imagine, more about it. So here we see that that despite the fact that prices went down, that's already more than a year after the invasion of Ukraine, there's still a lot of trade policy actions that remain there, that they were not temporarily. So as of February 23, there were indeed 252 policy measures, and basically those are affecting food and also fertilizers. So, and most of these measures obviously are active measures on export restrictions, and as I'll show it here, a lot of these export restrictions are basically export bans, which in principle, and I'm saying that knowing that in some countries they have the export ban, but whenever we see some of the data, there are still exports going on, especially in Russia. And indeed, in that case, there were basically 101 nations that were responsible for the increase in trade-related prices, and since the beginning of the war. We can see that, for instance, on the export restrictions, there were basically 19 countries and 15, in Europe and Central Asia, obviously including Russia, including other countries of the former Soviet Union, and 15 of them, they had export bans. We can see also that perhaps the European Union was perhaps as a bloc the less active on that. On the import liberalization side, we have a lot of countries in Latin America that basically, as a way of combating this surge in food prices, liberalized. And when I'm talking about liberalization, it's not only tariffs; they also include sometimes reduction in other import-related taxes, like a value-added tax, or some other fees other than tariffs, etc. So let me go a little bit on the next one because of the time. So this graph will show you a little bit what has been the policy activism in terms of trade cover, and here we're basically looking at the share. In a world of pre-COVID, I think is the average from 2017 and 2020, 2019. What has been the share of trade of exports in the case of export-related restrictions, and on imports in the case of liberalizing that have been covered by these policy actions. So here we see that at the onset of the the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were basically around 6% of global trade that was on the export and on the import side that were covered by these policy actions, and then obviously it increased. You can see like this kind of sawdents that reflect a little bit, that reflect the fact that some of the countries withdraw some of these restrictions, especially on the exporting side, and then some other countries put additional restrictions. So that's why we have like this irregularity. Whereas on the importing side, it has been quite interesting, because we see that there is by July of last year, there is around 16% of food imports that are being covered by import liberalization, and this share kind of remains on time. Of course, I mean, a lot of these countries, I mean, there's still a way of trying to combat this surge in prices, and let's see what's gonna be happening. I mean, we know that after the COVID-19 crisis, there has been a lot of fiscal pressure on the public budgets, and you know, in some of the countries, there's still an important, and in developing countries, it's still an important source of public revenue. So this next graph is basically means to show that export bans have a limited impact on global prices of these staples, but there may be a risk of having like restrictions, especially by major producers, by major exporters, that could drive prices higher. So this is basically some estimates my colleagues did. Using putting some assumptions and basically assuming that the total reduction in export quantities from trading partners come from these export bans, and they use these elasticities by Fontanier and co-authors basically to estimate what would be the kind of direct price effect. Of course, this is a strong assumption, but I think it's to do like a kind of some back of the envelope estimates is quite good. Here we see that, for instance, the trade cover, that's basically for last year, using again the trade data of pre-COVID. So we see that wheat and mesclun, prices were quite, the price change has been high in the first 2 quarters, and then the price change kind of went down and kind of remained relatively low for the last quarter. So the projection basically is, the projection is an estimate of what would happen if one of the average top exporters would put in place an export ban. So I think in the wheat and mesclun, I think the top 3 exporters are of course, Russia, Canada, the US, etc. I can see I can give you the details later. So just to tell you that in the short term, there has been this increase in international price caused basically by export bans, can be detrimental for all, and then it went obviously down. But if one of these top exporters put in place another export ban, there may be a significant increase in the price of these commodities. So this other slide shows a little bit how developing nations basically dependent on food imports will suffer the most basically of a surge in food prices. And one of the issues is, of course, that the lack of diversification of import sources and of course the dietary composition make countries more vulnerable to export restrictions that are imposed by these very, very big exporters. This map will show you a little bit the share of imported kilocalories that are subject to export restrictions as of February 2023 of this year. So we can see the countries in the north of Africa that are quite dependent on that. We can see countries like Kazakhstan, or countries in the North Africa. Perhaps Latin America is, with the exception of Ecuador, is a little bit perhaps a region that is less dependent. So export restrictions currently in place represent between 20 and 60% of imported kilocalories for developing countries, and indeed countries such as Azerbaijan, the North African countries, Tunisia, Libya, There are also countries in the Middle East, Lebanon, Yemen, and Egypt, are quite dependent on food imports. So these are of course some I mean, a summary of some steps to prevent another surge in food prices. I mean, it's kind of well known that of course restrictions should be eased. Exporters should refrain from stockpiling goods, banning, taxing, or restricting exports. Whenever there are these emergency restrictions, they should be targeted, they should be transparent, proportionate, temporary, of course, and all this in compliance with the WTO rules. And also, they should take into account the impact on third countries, especially the least developed. On the importer side, of course, there should be a permanent reduction or elimination of some of the import tariffs and other taxes to ensure adequate supply in good times, and a permanent reform would also reduce the uncertainty and is likely to attract new exporters. And of course, diversifying imports would also reduce the vulnerability. From the international community, including the international organization, there should also be an improvement in transparency, in the sense that there should be like more information on the evolution and impact of these trade policy actions. Of course, the efforts of the GTA in that sense is really, I mean, is contributing to this end. And there should also be more information on the evolution of the global supply of food staples. This would reduce uncertainty and lower the risk of escalating measures and countermeasures. Let me just jump quickly to the last slide, where I wanted to tell you a little bit what we're doing at the bank, what we're planning to do. So the analysis I showed you before was a little bit using historical trade data, basically, I mean, on the flows. Because I mean, there's still like the recent data that will appear, especially last year's at the global level. So once this data is available, we're planning to analyze the role of the actual role that trade policy had on food security through increases in international prices using obviously like this data during the first year, and of course price data. Also at the World Bank, we're also initiating this study that will include the background papers, I mean research background papers on trade policies, food security, and climate change. So here are some of the research questions that we're planning to attack. Of course, the very first one, and I think it's relevant to the work Kai, Mark Andreas, and others have been doing, is on the role of trade policy uncertainty, or how is it impacting food security during periods of food crisis. Excuse me. Well, another question we're planning to attack using local prices on some of the commodities and in different towns and different markets is to see what is the impact of trade policy interventions, and by that I mean tariff changes in non-tariff measures or other customs regulation on local food prices. So we're basically going to be trying to quantify the price transmission or pass-through from international to local prices, because a lot of the models, especially ECG models, they kind of have the assumption that there is a full pass-through of a change in, say, in tariffs that will basically go 100% to the consumers. But in reality, we know that there are different companies, business have different markups and also different market power, and this pass-through is not always complete, or it's rather rarely complete. So we're also trying to see what is the impact of trade policy on agricultural inputs, notably on fertilizers. Then we're also going to be looking at the distributional impact of these trade policies related to food security, basically who are the winners and losers across and within countries. Excuse me. So another aspect is basically what areas, what are the roles of agricultural policies and subsidies, and basically how they're going to be affecting, what kind of alternative policy instruments interact with trade policy in driving basically price and quantity volatility and food insecurity. So we're also going to be tackling the environmental questions and looking at how can trade help in reducing the environmental footprint of the food system, and then especially for I mean, this is very relevant for the EU and for other countries that are trying to put this trade-related climate policy in place. So we're going to be trying to see what are the net impacts of border carbon adjustments and other instruments on climate, nature, food, nutrition security, resilience, and sustainability of the global food system. So I think that's the presentation I have for today, and yeah, I'm open to questions, or perhaps we keep it at the end of other presentations.
Okay, thank you very much, Alberto. Yeah, we are going to hold questions until the end. So I think to keep things moving, we'll have Simon and Mark up next.
Thanks, Kyle. And I'll start on Mark is going to follow up with the specifics of the empirical findings. So just to situate our study, one manifestation of geopolitics is the weaponization of international trade flows. Now, if I was sitting in California, I guess the first thing that would come to mind would be export controls on advanced technologies. However, weaponization can take the form of commodities too, such as wheat. And of course, such weaponization may bear upon food insecurity in other countries. Now, discussing wheat in our context really means discussing what Russia is currently up to. And although Russia is not an economic behemoth in the world economy, it is a large producer of certain commodities such as wheat. In fact, Russia's expected to be to produce about 20% of this year's wheat, or at least have 20% of the global market, I should say, of wheat. And what we are going to do here is to examine what Russia's motives are and what form its weaponization could take. Well, we see two motives for Russia's wheat weaponization. One is to disrupt the Ukrainian economy, to lower incomes there, especially farm incomes, and tax collection, which in turn would make financing the counterattack against Russia's invasion harder. Another consequence of disrupting wheat exports through the Black Sea would be to discourage farmers there from planting for the next season, which in turn multiplies the effects. Russia may also be interested in taxing its own wheat exports so as to finance the military adventure in Ukraine. And here it's also worth noting, in this very week, Russia is changing the way it taxes its own oil and gas exports so as to increase the tax yield as well. So ultimately, Russia has, I think, two motives for possibly wanting to restrict exports of wheat. It has three means available to doing that. One is to take wheat off the world market by domestic stockpiling. A second is to block Ukraine's exports through the Black Sea. And the third is to, as I said earlier, impose export curbs. And it's worth noting here, Russia has real form in this respect. Since the beginning of 2022, on 112 occasions, Russia has changed export policies towards agricultural goods, and not just wheat, that's all goods. And since the beginning of this year, Russia has made 12 export tax changes, two of which were reductions in export taxes, the rest increases. So there's a track record here which goes back years in terms of what Russia has done. Now, the questions that Mark and I tried to answer in this particular paper were, first, what leverage does Russia really have over wheat markets this year, bearing in mind that other countries produce wheat too, and their forecasted production must be taken into account. And secondly, given that the Black Sea grain deal has just been extended for another 60 days, what could really account for Russia's agreement to extend that? Did it really give up that much, or is there something else going on? And my colleague Mark will take us through the results.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I just take over, Kyle, if that is okay with you. I did not wait for you.
Yes, go for it.
Okay, thank you. So as Simon mentioned, Russia has a number of incentives and tools in place to manipulate the global wheat market. It generates its own revenues. It may also engage in food diplomacy and have incentives there. And as Simon said, I'm going to walk through some of our findings now. So our idea was to study incentives that the Kremlin may have and the Russian economy may face that come from these wheat market manipulations that Russia has been engaged in recently with the export taxes, in longer term by establishing and expanding its United Grain Company. In Russian, it's also known as the OZK, basically a group that is Kremlin controlled, Kremlin owned, and channels most of Russia's wheat trade. So while we will present our findings in terms of export taxes, and as Simon mentioned, they are important policy tools, the Kremlin has way more ways of capturing the value added from the wheat trade for its own pockets. One is the UGC, this United Grain Company, and others, as we learn over time now, might be former state-owned farms, wheat farms, that have been transformed in vertically integrated companies that can manage the stockpiling, as Simon mentioned, and that can basically also manage wheat prices for the exports by withholding strategically what they think should be withheld out of political rather than economic considerations. We can study 170 industries and 44 countries directly. We have added in this simulation 8 more. Important wheat producers such as Kazakhstan often fall off standard models, but they are crucial in this market, so we've brought them in. So let me walk you through in 2 slides some of our main insights. So we've simulated basically a world economy that is untouched by Russian interventions. That's the 0% green line, no change to Russian exports. We've simulated one where Russia reduces its exports of wheat by a quarter, 25%, in order to capture some of the revenues through export taxes, and a second scenario of Russia cutting by 50%. You might think of these scenarios as unrealistic, and we know that they are meant as benchmarks. We actually deliberately chose to do that. We did not want to write a report how Russia can best manipulate the wheat market. We wanted to write a report that shows incentives, and we just picked benchmark numbers. So if Russia does not intervene in the wheat market, it will expand its exports by 4.2%. That is a prediction of the US Department of Agriculture's most recent release. Our model captures that. That comes because Russia is expanding its harvest. And then we look how different scenarios for the Ukraine treatment, and especially the Black Sea deal, might affect world prices and Russia's exports as a consequence. And what we find is that as you go from 0% intervention in Ukraine's wheat exports to basically blocking them up to 95%, Russia benefits its own wheat exports only by a small extent. We don't see a strong increase in this green curve. However, and that is probably a reason why Russia stays away from blocking wheat exports too much, if indeed Ukrainian wheat exports were blocked to about, say, 50%, then the additional exports that the world generates next season of 0.4 million tons, that's not much, would result in a export reduction, mostly triggered by Ukraine's lack of exports, and then quite dramatic price increases that call in other competing countries, wheat exporters, to raise their production and sell off some of their stockpiles, so that we'd see actually a strong increase in world exports that Russia would trigger from a pretty severe cutback of Ukrainian wheat exports. In other words, there's strong disincentives for Russia to do that. It would not benefit itself much, but would call on other export countries to step in and reduce its own market power in the world wheat market. That is one simple economic rationale why Russia might not want the Ukraine exports to be banned, and why it keeps extending. Just recently, a week ago, the Black Sea deals. In addition, obviously, it has the advantage of looking favorable and as a fair player in the wheat market, while disguising really its actual impact. If it cut back its exports by 25%, so those are the orange curves here, in the absence of any further reductions to Ukraine, that would cut back 6.6 million tons of wheat exports in the world market. If you cut back 50%, 17.4 would be lacking. So it has a major impact on world markets. And as we argue, it actually has the incentives to use its power. So here come simple simulations of both the 1/4 cut in exports and a half cut in exports and the benefits Russia might generate. To give you a notion of the magnitudes, in December 2022, Russia's wheat exports were last tracked, and they amounted to about $9 billion US dollars. That was top months for Russia's wheat exports. They keep growing. And if you just give a rough annual number to that, that would be 100 billion wheat sales a year now if Russia can keep up that high December number. 50% of those revenues and exports are actually value added, generated in the Russian economy. So that's subtracting off all the seeds, the fertilizer, the harvesting machinery operation, and so forth. 50% would be value added. And the simulations show how much of that value added the Russian government, the Kremlin, can capture. In the case of a 1/4 export cut, our simulation suggests that export taxes could collect about 30% of that value added. So that puts you easily in the magnitude of several tens of billions of US dollars. So those are massive magnitude. We're not arguing that Russia indeed will cut back exports by 25%, but through its export taxes, through the UGC, its trading company, and those vertically integrated wheat growing enterprises, it can capture quite a chunk of that. Again, we are not in the business of making recommendations to Russia. We're just showing basic magnitudes. If Russia were to cut back exports by half through export taxes or other interventions, it could capture almost 50% of that baseline value added. So these are massive numbers. The cost to the Russian economy, however, would be massive. So obviously 25% or 50% of the value added to farmers or farm owners and farm workers would be gone. In addition, the distortion that Russia generates through that intervention to the economy as a whole amounts to almost multiples of that. 40% of baseline value added in wheat growing, or 90% in the 50% cut case. So Russia would inflict quite a heavy damage on its economy, but arguably collect a massive amount of revenues for the Kremlin. And in a war economy, it might have all the incentives to do so. Let me stop here and hand back over to Kyle. We are ready for more questions in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark and Simon. Okay, so our next panelist is Joseph Glauber. So Joe, go ahead and get your slides fired up. And if you're out there in the audience and you already have some questions, don't hesitate to put those in the Q&A, because I'll start keeping track of them so that we're ready to go in about 10 minutes here.
Well, thanks. And as usual, my screen doesn't seem to be cooperating with me, but trying to see if I can get this into. Okay, are you seeing full screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So thanks. And this is great. I'm going to, a lot of the comments I'm going to make today are going to follow right on the heels of the two other presentations, and I think dovetail nicely. Yeah, so if one looks at where prices have been over the last year, we saw this big run up in prices, still not quite as high as what we saw in 2007-8, which one, at least if you deflate it using a US CPI, we saw much higher prices that period. But just to say, it's not just agriculture. I think as Alberto mentioned, it's also fuels, it's also fertilizer. And, those things peaked in the early part of 2022 with the war, and have come down pretty much from about May on, have declined substantially. But I think the important thing is they remain far, far above levels, particularly comparing them to 2020. We also have seen a lot of volatility in the markets. This is just the implied futures or implied price volatility from the futures markets. And there you'd have to, you really have to go back to periods like 2007, 8, 2010, 11, 2012, 13, times when global stocks also were very, very tight in world markets. My basic takeaway from how markets have performed this year is that they've been actually remarkably resilient, despite losing 10%, initially 10% of the world's wheat, which comes out of Ukraine. Other markets did step up, as you'd expect, with high prices, kind of the point that Mark made just a few seconds ago. But countries did come in and supply more wheat to the world. We saw very large exports out of India and places like Brazil, which aren't typically large wheat exporters. But we did see export restrictions, and I think that this is not, this chart looks very similar to what Alberto showed, certainly the great work that Simon's been doing with the Global Trade Alert. What we do at IFPRI is we calculate exports, we aggregate them on a caloric basis. So this is just another way, rather than looking at them on value or looking at it on volume traded, but looking at the essentially converting all of those agricultural exports to calories. So it gives a slightly different look, but you can see a very similar pattern. One is that the blue line there on the first chart is just export restrictions during COVID. You can see that they were relatively short-lived. Most came and then went off. Really, by the end of the summer, were off. With 2007-8, they tended to linger a little bit longer, but you can see from what's been going on in Ukraine, at least the volume that was affected by exports, really by the end of the summer had really kind of come down considerably. And I want to talk now, the other thing, and I think this was mentioned by all of the previous speakers, is that if you look at it by commodity, before I get into that, if you look at it at commodity, you can see where this is not surprising. A lot of this has been wheat, as Mark mentioned, Simon mentioned. Russia's had an export tax on, actually, they've had an export tax in place for roughly the last 2 years or so. They've used export restrictions, they have a long history of actually imposing export bans and other things. These export restrictions imposed by Russia are price-based, so they are adjusted monthly to take into account declines they tend to be higher when prices are, the export taxes are higher when prices are high. So they tend to be high right before the new crop comes in, and then when the new crop comes in, those taxes tend to go down. So it's important to understand those mechanics of the actual restrictions themselves. But you can see here at least things like palm oil, which I'm going to get into in more detail in just a second. But palm oil, very big. One of the 50% of the palm oil market comes out of over 50% comes out of Indonesia. Indonesia had export bans on, export taxes on, and then in March put on a ban May put on a ban that was fairly short-lived, and then after that has been gone. And in the recent part, you see that India actually put in some export bans on broken rice. So this commodity mix has changed over time. The other thing is that again, the countries that are imposing them, you can see here that Russia, again, the major one on wheat, in particular, has been export restrictions, yet they are selling a lot of wheat, and I'll get back to that in a minute. The other thing is the lack of transparency. Were it not for Global Trade Alert, World Bank, WTO, and outfits like IFPRI that are tracking this, we'd have countries just do a very poor job of actually reporting this to the WTO. And I think that's really important. The other big thing is that these restrictions really vary. So, not all restrictions are alike in terms of their impact on trade. So we have, in some cases, we're picking up, at least in our tracker, licensing requirements that are put in place. They may or may not be that onerous. Export taxes, for example, as I mentioned, Russia has had an export tax. They will probably, even with that tax, have a record export level this year. On the other hand, bans are pretty tight, but even there, as we're going to see in a minute, that they really some bans are a lot more firm than others. So I'm going to start with Indonesia. So Indonesia, as I mentioned, had export taxes on early this year, early 2022. But in late April, they put a ban on. Why is palm oil so important? It accounts for 62% of the major 4 vegetable oils that are traded in the world. Indonesia is a large player, accounting for 55% of palm oil exported in the world. So roughly 1/3 of the vegetable oil market in the world coming out of Indonesia, and they put a hard ban on palm oil exports. Well, it didn't last long. Why? Because export bans are not only hurting the rest of the world, they also hurt domestic producers. And Indonesia had a lot of pushback from the biodiesel industry, the palm oil producers and some of the processors who were very dependent on exports. So it came off and exports resumed. And yet by the end of the year, if you look at cumulative exports, they exported about as much as they did in 2021. So short-lived, very big at the time. Vegetable oil prices leapt 15-20% almost overnight when that ban was put in place, but short-lived. The other one is India, which also put a ban on wheat exports. India is pretty interesting. India typically exports about 2 to 3 million tons a year. Not a lot if you look at the last 10 years. Yet 2021, they had a very big year, 6.2 million tons. And coming into 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, India started making statements in the press saying, "Hey, we could help supply the rest of the world with the wheat that's not coming out of Ukraine. We think we could export as much as 10 million tons." That lasted for about a month, and then drought issues emerged in the Punjab, major wheat producing area in India, and all of a sudden the government said, "Look, we're putting on a ban." But you can see that despite that ban, it was many months before the actual wheat export shut off. Why? Because India said that it would, despite the ban, it would honor any letters of credit that it had, and it had sold forward a lot of wheat. And it also said that it would continue to supply to neighboring countries. So you can see that those red bars really started tailing off by the fall. But, again, on an annual basis, very, very large exports, particularly in the first part of the year. I might add, there is concern going forward because they still have a ban on wheat exports, despite having a slightly better crop or a better crop this year. So if you look at this is that same chart I showed in terms of the share of kilocalories restricted by export restrictions, and just lay the FAO food price index on top of that, very close relationship, I mean, with 10 dots. I don't want to make too much of it. Again, the causality, I wouldn't argue causality at all, because I think in one sense, certainly export restrictions can, as we saw in the case of palm oil, certainly precipitate big price increases. Also, by the same token, an improving market situation can also cause producers to take those, or countries to take those restrictions off. Okay, and then lastly, I just want to shift quickly to sanctions. I realize sanctions came up in the previous seminar, but here I think it is really important to try to gauge what the impacts of those sanctions are. We get a lot of questions from the press and others about it, because Russia has said that sanctions are hurting us, our grain and fertilizer exports, and yet, the EU, US, and others who are imposing sanctions say that food and agriculture, food and fertilizer is not being really affected. Here you can just see the impacts. Russia wheat exports appear to be up about 11% in 2022 relative to 2021. I say appear to be because Russia currently isn't reporting exports. We have to glean what they are exporting via mirror trade and other things by looking at import data from reporting importers. But based on that, it looks like certainly some of the major fertilizer components like diammonium phosphate, urea, and wheat are all up. Yet there are significant issues with things like anhydrous ammonia, an important fertilizer, nitrogen-based fertilizer component. That actually is not a result of sanctions. It's a result of the fact that they have a huge pipeline that goes from plants on the Volga River down to Odessa ports, and that's been blocked by the war and isn't likely to reopen. But if you look at potash, on the other hand, Russia and Belarus account for about 40% of the trade in potash. Russia potash exports are down about 21%. Belarus potash, which again, Belarus has been affected not just by the sanctions because of their involvement or their alliance with Russia over the war in Ukraine, but also because of the downing of the Ryanair jet, or the diversion of the Ryanair jet and the removal of the Belarusian dissident off the plane. EU put on pretty strict sanctions. So Belarus, which normally would export potash through Baltic ports in Lithuania and Latvia, those have been blocked. And as a consequence, their potash exports have been down considerably. But the other side is, if you look at the major importers, how they are accommodating that. Brazil, the largest fertilizer importer in the world, you can see them shift trade, importing a lot more from Canada. And actually, they haven't actually been able to meet a lot of their import needs from Russia itself. Belarus is down considerably. Okay, that's it for me. I'll look forward to the discussion.
All right. I want to thank all of our panelists. So this has been a really interesting discussion. If you have questions, go ahead and drop them into the Q&A. So I don't see any yet. So go ahead and, anything you want to know, I'll try to feed it through in the last 10 minutes here. I have one question, and I'm not going to put it to anyone in particular, but I was struck by something Alberto said, which is basically that when these export bans go into place, I think it was on the slide, it said, regardless of the source, if these things happen, there are price effects. And I think what it says to me, which is interesting about these commodity type markets, is that you can diversify your source countries where you're getting wheat from, but that won't matter too much on a world market, other than various differences in transport and freight costs depending on where it's coming from. And so I guess there's the buzzword in supply chains right now is this, the supply chains need to be more diversified, but those are very manufacturing production oriented. And I think when you start thinking about agriculture, I almost think it seems futile in that, how do we diversify our access to these commodities where, all it takes is Russia invading Ukraine, or some of these big producers, like in Joe's presentation, India, putting an import ban on. And it's like, well, forget it. It doesn't matter if you were getting this stuff from multiple sources. The price is, these are traded on world markets and they're going to go up. And so just, general question to the panelists here, like, what can we do about that? Is there a solution to this other than just stop using all these export restrictions and bans and things like that? What's next? What have we learned here?
Yeah, let me take a first crack at it. I think a lot of it depends on how big that country is in terms of its supply. I mean, look, my example of Indonesia was well chosen in the sense that they are a huge player in the world market, and you saw what happened. Everyone panicked. India was really in particular, because India imports a lot of cooking oil and from Indonesia, so they were very concerned. Wheat is produced everywhere, and it's amazing. You look at a country like Brazil, which isn't a very major exporter of wheat at all. In fact, they're a net importer. Last year, they were finding wheat and sending it out. I think. The problem is a short-run problem with agriculture, in the sense that you can't just produce overnight. You have to plant. You have to wait till the planting season. But this year, you look at if you go around the world, this could have been a lot worse. 2022 could have been a lot worse than it was. We were really helped by the fact that Australia had a huge crop that was in 2020 that was harvested at the beginning of 2022. They had another huge crop that's been harvested right now. Argentina had a big crop last year, a really poor crop this year. But you can see where a lot of countries really had much bigger crops. Canada had a much bigger crop this year. Russia had a record crop, wheat crop. And so all of that helped bring wheat prices down. And frankly, even though stocks are still tight, prices have come down considerably in the wheat market. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Maybe I can add a little from our
that'd be great.
perspective to that question. So there were really two, Kyle. One is how dependent are individual countries on their sources. And to our surprise in the simulation, actually, the global wheat market is a global market, but there's still quite a bit of a source dependence. So for example, we played Russia against Ukraine with export cuts, and Egypt and Turkey are extremely dependent on Russian grain shipments. Bangladesh and Nigeria too. So beyond Alberto's map, they showed up red on our map. But then when you take Ukraine's shortfalls, Turkey is much less affected, and some other Middle Eastern countries like Lebanon much more. So it seems that existing export relations actually keep playing out in price responses, even though you'd think that substitution should be simpler. So that is one thing that struck us about how global the wheat market is. There's still some source dependence. And the other thing that I think it goes also to what Joe just mentioned, there are huge producers in the world. India is the currently third largest after the EU. The largest is China. But China, even though they make 134 billion tons a year in 2021, they actually are still net importers. India is a slight net exporter, and Russia is only number 4 in terms of production, but is number 1 by far in terms of exporting. So with that discrepancy, there's also a whole lot of adjustment in the world market in the sense that the top producers, if they shrink their consumption just a little bit and ship out as exports, that can have a quite quick dampening effect. And so the wheat price decline, I think, may have to do with the fact that some typical exporters that don't export much, typical producers that don't export much, can quickly become exporters. So those are my 2 points on that, and thanks, it's a great question.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question in the Q&A from Renee Bowen. She says, a question for all panelists. So countries have started to coordinate efforts to monitor critical supply chains, primarily in manufacturing, as I just mentioned. She wanted to know if there are similar efforts to monitor and coordinate food supply chains among countries, which I think is a great question. And then she also says as a follow-up, if they're not doing that, how would you recommend they go about it?
Yeah, let me just start. Indeed, I mean, I think the main thing is providing information on these markets, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you know, remember these are private commercial firms are doing a lot of the movement of grain around the world, and so you know, if Egypt needs grain, they put out a tender, and you have 10 suppliers in there bidding on those tenders. But information is really important, and the other hat I wear is secretary of something called the Agricultural Market Information System, which is a G20 institution that was created back in 2011 to monitor agricultural markets. So we put out a monthly report. You know, we meet with country focal points, you know, who are doing all the supply and demand estimates within their countries. We meet with them on a monthly basis, go over their reports, and then publish something. And you know, it's not different. It's not that much different than what, say, International Grains Council puts out or what USDA puts out. And in fact, our report actually includes those 2 other estimates as well. But it's essentially seen as an objective source for information. And we do a little bit of, you know, at the political level, that is at the governmental level, of when countries put on export bans and things like that, to, you know, discuss those in a forum that you know, hopefully at least stresses that this is that markets aren't as dire as people think, that they're putting on these export bans. They don't need to. There are ample supplies on world markets and things like that. And I think there has actually had some impacting during COVID because of that. And I can remember back in 2012, when we had a huge North American drought, there was a lot of concern and countries were talking about export bans. But in fact, we came out and said, look, there's plenty of supplies out there. Feed grain market is a much bigger market than wheat, and that's what was essentially affected at the time. And I think that really helped calm waters.
Thank you, Joe. We have time for one more question, and I'm just reading one out of the Q&A here. So she says, this is a question for Mark, and I suppose Simon as well, but so based on your research, what's the best way the nations and allies can combat the weaponization of a good such as wheat? And we talked about diversifying sources, but that can be hard to do quickly. Are there more long-term protections from places like Russia weaponizing a good export like this ever again? And I guess just to follow up on that myself, I wrote this down when you were speaking, Mark. As I wonder how quickly, and it maybe sort of goes to your model itself, like how quickly can countries really adjust? I mean, because with some of these crops, like you have to plant them and then wait. And I wondered how much adjustment over the past 12 months has really been drawing down like inventories, and how much is like, Brazil coming online with additional wheat exports to make up the difference. I think these things are related. So we don't have too much more time yet. So if you can be brief, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, these are great questions. We've struggled with stockpiles. They're not typically in models. So I cannot really give you the quick answer on the decomposition. But for Delaney Crabtree's question, what can we do beyond diversification? So Simon's and my take was, first of all, call out the likely manipulations by showing incentives and keeping the world alert that renewing the Black Sea grain deal is not really Russia's long-term game, most likely. And Joe mentioned how long Russia has been manipulating wheat markets. So I think it's probably going to take something a lot like in the oil and gas market, that Russia cannot sell for its desired price. There will be caps, but we can promise a little sanctions alleviation, so to say. Some may go through. In the case of wheat, where there are no sanctions, other goods would be allowed through, and it will be a back and forth. The important thing, I think, is in the first place to be alert. If you read the news, and that's what motivated Simon and me, it's all about oil or semiconductors. And in between is this huge segment of food security that somehow goes unobserved. And so I think just raising the alert is already helping the world community be prepared.
Maybe I could just add one thing here is, this isn't so much about stopping the weaponization, but limiting the fallout from weaponization. And I think we really need to make sure that the World Bank and some of the regional development banks have enough finances on hand to be able to support those developing countries which are heavily food dependent. So when weaponization hits, you cushion the blow to family budgets and the like. And I think so. Again, one can work on discouraging weaponization and also blunting its consequences. So a package here might make sense.
Carl, if I could, let me make one comment about the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And one thing where I think it is in Russia's interest is that, if you look at UN votes and things like that on sanctions generally and other things, there's a big chunk of the world that has tried to remain neutral in all of this. And I think that what we found is in November, when Russia suspended the Black Sea Grain Agreement, that a number of those countries protested and came and there was this meeting from the African Union rep Sall from Senegal went to Moscow during that period to argue to extend the agreement and other things. So I think that it's one thing to say, well, I'm neutral in terms of this overall conflict that's going on in far away in Europe from their perspective, but yet another thing to say, hey, all the same, keep the trade flowing. And I think that's, something to take into consideration at least.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank all of our panelists. This has been a wonderful panel on food security. To follow up on what Mark had just mentioned is, I think there has been like a almost obsessive focus on semiconductors and oil and natural gas, but this food security issue is massive, and food makes up a large share of, like, if you look at worldwide, a large share of people's budget. And so paying attention to this, as well as oil and gas and microchips, is super important. It was wonderful to have all of you here to talk to us today. So thank you very much. This is being recorded. If you want to watch it again later, maybe after some light editing, we'll hopefully have it on the website soon. So that's all I have. And we hope to see you again for another webinar in the future. Maybe we'll come follow up on this again, or there'll be something new going on in the world economy, and we can talk about that too. So thanks again, everyone.